Considering the different rooms that designers are in, the way they move through the world, what they're looking at globally in terms of their own work and the number of theaters they're in, I just find it remarkable that more designers are not in genuine leadership positions.
Hello and welcome to Art Restart, where we explore how artists are reinventing their fields and building a new landscape for the arts. My name is Rob Kramer, and I'm the founder and CEO of Kramer Leadership, whose mission is to advance leaders for the greater good.
And I'm Pier Carlo, the producer and editor of this podcast, brought to you by the Kenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts.
In this episode, we're spending time with set designer Rachel Hauck.
2019 was a banner year for Rachel. 2 of her designs were on Broadway in acclaimed productions: the Tony-nominated play What the Constitution Means to Me, and the musical Hadestown, which won the Tony for Best Musical and also earned Rachel her first Tony for Scenic Design.
The recognition came after almost 3 decades of consistent work in the theater, starting in her hometown of Los Angeles and then in regional theaters all over the country, from the renowned Oregon Shakespeare Festival to the O'Neill National Playwrights Conference in Connecticut, where she served as the resident set designer for 10 years.
When she and her partner and frequent collaborator, director Lisa Peterson, moved from Los Angeles to New York, Rachel quickly established herself as one of the most in-demand designers for the city's most respected off-Broadway theaters. And in 2016, she received an Obie Award for Sustained Excellence of Set Design.
Rachel spoke to us from Irvine, California, where she spent much of the pandemic looking after her mother. I asked her if, when the pandemic hit, she had a number of projects that were immediately put on hold.
Oh, completely. Yeah. No, I had an awful lot of projects that were completely stopped, and the calls came one after another in a totally heartbreaking way. And then some of them were optimistically rescheduled and canceled again. And even though we expected that might happen, and when you got the, email telling you that there was going to be a phone call, there was no question about what it was, and it continued to be hard every single time. I didn't, I was seeing plays every night, and the last thing I saw was Cambodian Rock Band. And then I went and over to the place across the street where everybody in the theater world goes for a drink after a show on 42nd Street, and there were 6 people in it, and it was unbelievable. I called my friend Mara Isaacs, who happened to be in town, and we went over to Mara's and drank a bottle of champagne and said, "Okay, here we go." And then I went back home. I flew to California for 2 days to see my mom, which turned into 2 weeks. And then I came home and didn't see my studio again for 3 months. And when I went downtown and walked into that studio, it was, as we'd left it, my assistant had worked for a couple days past me. She left a light on because she'd left in a hurry. And just before they locked down the city. And I walked into the studio, and it was heartbreaking because it was like a mausoleum of dead plays. There was an enormous pile of mail, and all the models were still out, and the plant was dead. And it was truly shocking. It was truly shocking.
What's the mental transition you've had to go through working, I imagine, incredibly long hours and being productive and having success to suddenly it stopping?
It was crushing and shocking. It's been very, we were all, I don't think any of us realized how high a level we were functioning at until it stopped, and how many, to do productions of that scale and, in multiple venues, and we were beginning to think about the tour at that point. And one show was already on tour, and, it was, I think I was in genuine shock for a very long time. A month, 6 weeks, I did a couple of podcasts early on in which people were like, "Well, how you doing?" And I was like, "Not well." Just in shock. And to have had such a game-changing year and then to suddenly come to a stop, it is shocking personally, and yet it is impossible to not be aware how lucky we were. My mother was okay. Lisa and I were okay. We had our health. We had a place to be. We were financially, if I had not happened to have the year I had, in 2019, I would have been in enormous trouble. And so I felt very, very aware of that as well. And honestly, how many of our peers and my friends are not going to come out of this well.
Did 2020 give you a clear sense of what things you'd like to see change in your field, things you'd want to reinvent or fix?
I mean, sure, I'm deep. Most of my energy has gone to working on all of the racial justice stuff that has got to change within our field, and I've been extraordinarily fortunate to be in conversation with a group that called Design Action, which is about particularly looking at all of these issues from in the design community. And so that has been, being a part of keeping that conversation going and opening doors and trying to just change how this business runs in order to make it a more equitable field has been a massive part of my life for the last 6 months.
Can you describe when you say changing the way this business is run to make it more equitable? What are some of the basic things that need to be re-examined and changed?
Well, there are so many, and they have been so graciously laid out for us by We See You. Um,
Mhm.
but
Right.
within our field, I mean, there's an enormous amount of expectation. Design has for a long time been considered. Back in the day, it was a gentleman's profession. There was not any real. The fees are very low, the hours are very long. The assumption is that we would just make it work, and of course, the number of artists that excludes is incredible, and I don't know that anybody had considered how many people just could not be a part of the conversation and how exclusive the storytelling was based on the fact that people had to be able to be completely financially independent before they could even consider this as a field until you get a real until you get a really lucky break. I mean, even working, I remember the first day I got a really great off Broadway job. And I thought, oh, here it is at last. I'm going to start to be a little more solvent. And then I saw the fee and I was furious and heartbroken at the same time because it just is 100% untenable. And I'm very fortunate. There's never been a question that one way or another I would have a roof over my head, but it has been a charitable job. I mean, like literally, my profit is deep in the poverty level until about 3 or 4 years ago, which is not what you would think if you look at the work I've been lucky enough to do. So there's some radical imbalances about what is expected and what we have accommodated for years and years and years. So there's an awful lot there, but there's in terms of equity, we have got to get we've got to get more the doors open for more people. I mean, if you go backstage at any theater on Broadway, that's not equal representation on either side of the footlights. And so, how we both take care in the way that we tell stories and make it possible for more people to tell these stories. It's a big conversation.
Another success you had in 2019 was helping spearhead the first collectively bargained agreement ever for designers working off Broadway. And I'm
Yes.
curious if there's any, yeah, huge score.
Yes.
Can you summarize what you accomplished?
Beginning to stare down this fundamental belief that this is just part of the business, this is just what it takes, and starting to take a step back in this time and say it's just unacceptable. We are lucky to be artists, but we need to be valued as artists. And so helping people understand what the actual toll is on the people they have come to expect to be part of their productions. I think that whole layer of conversation, which has come immediately out of being a part of those negotiations, has been incredibly affecting in as we move forward here.
Can you tell us, other than getting essentially a raise or raising the amount of money that you and your fellow designers would be paid off Broadway. What is a major concession that you got that most of us would not have thought of or would not know you needed as a designer working off Broadway?
It's mostly financial, it has to do with how much equipment we have to do the jobs, and that we're all expected to own programs that cost an enormous amount of money every year. The
Oh,
basic drafting programs, the basic sound programs, the equipment that the sound designers are expected to own and bring with them to tech in order to do that work. Stuff like that, where it's just like this is all part of the financial issue that we're struggling against. And also there's a certain amount of, and I would say that we had mixed success with this, acknowledging that the designers are a major part of the production, in the sense of the recognition of, for example, the requirement to, put our names on the mailers. We did not succeed at that. So you will see the directors and the actors credited, but the designers' contributions is at the discretion of the theater, and whether or not they include us in their websites and our bios here and there, things like that, where it's just a basic way of representing the value the designers bring to the
and
production.
even though the photo they'll use in the mailer will undoubtedly contain your designs.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right.
And they know it is not to say that the artistic directors don't value our contribution, because they do. They 100% do,
Right.
and they recognize, the contribution that the design elements bring to the production. So it's fascinating, and it's like a cultural shift. And I mean, I cannot really describe how generous the conversation was. And of course, it was a negotiation, and all negotiations have tricky moments. But the conversation between the producers and the designers, was really generous for the most part. And we didn't get far enough. We didn't see a sea change in how we're being paid, but we saw progress. You know,
What did you learn about yourself as you stepped into these positions of leadership?
it is amazing to me. And again, these things that we haven't named until very, I hadn't named for myself until very recently. But it's extraordinary that, considering the different rooms that designers are in, the way they move through the world, what they're looking at globally in terms of their own work and the number of theaters they're in, I just find it remarkable that more designers are not in genuine leadership positions.
You've seen so many institutions and worked in so many settings, small, large, nonprofit, for profit. Looking at the other side of the street, do you get a sense of, without naming any names, the types of institutions that'll probably come out of this with good strategies and survive? And what is it that they have that they're seeing or have the abilities to do? What are some of the commonalities of the organizations you think will thrive
I don't know who's
post-pandemic?
going to make it through this. I mean, I genuinely don't know. I'm really terrified. I'm terrified we're going to lose a generation of artists, for sure, who just can't afford to sustain. The number of people who have moved out of New York, as in given up their apartments, it's a huge number of people, and it's from all levels of theater. Everybody in theater, for almost everybody in theater, is pretty hand to mouth. And so this kind of a hit, who can come back, who was established enough to come back, all those designers whose careers were about to break, all those students who just came out of school and needed
Mm.
to, start to get their toes wet in New York or Chicago, or those. I'm so nervous about how many artists we're going to lose, in every. I'm very focused on design right now because of this work I'm doing, but in every corner of storytelling. And in terms of the institutions, I cannot imagine there are many who are fortunate enough to have an endowment that is going to get them through what is going to turn out to be a 2-year closure. I cannot imagine how theaters are getting through this. And some of them have been, obviously we are all doing everything we can for every theater that we are closely associated with or have strong relationships with. Not too many people have turned to designers to look for a hand that way in this time, but we're here. But I don't have an answer to the question that's good. I mean, I just don't know who is positioned and well enough to truly survive this. I expect, the more major theaters, the more major off-Broadway houses will make it through in New York. But past that, I don't actually know.
Let me ask Rachel then, if you had like a magic wand and you could pull together the right people, the right circumstances, what would be a healthy place that you'd like to see the artistic and design world start after, once we can get going again?
I would love, in my fantasy of all fantasies, I would
Yeah.
love for everybody to have a little more time to work on the things they're excited to work on. I hate to always bring it back to money, but if people could be relieved a little bit of the financial desperation and urgency in order to have more space to work on things, boy, I would love that. I would love that. I would love to not be working on so much stuff at once and to be slow it down. There's an incredible benefit to having had to slow down, even though it's been a bit of a manic, crazy time, and such an intense full stop, which has really rocked everybody's world. But to start it back up, I can't. It's so hard for me to answer this question because it's so hard for me to see forward right now as we continue to get news and projections about how long it could be. I'm very lucky to be just beginning work on a project for Baltimore Center Stage called The Garden, which will be done whether or not there's an audience there. They're going to build a new production and develop this piece of work, and that feels thrilling to me. And there's a bunch of logistics happening around the tour of Hadestown and the machine of Hadestown as it continues to move on. But the gold of what could be ahead, the opportunity for people to have a little more breath and a little more stability so that they can really lean into the conversations. I don't know if when we come back there's going to be a flood of work, or if people are going to stand a little caught in the headlights from having been so fully stopped. I would imagine, listen, I'm talking to you from my mother's garage, right? So, like, once I get back to my studio, I don't know. The building that's my studio is in feels different. The neighborhood feels different. Last time I was there, which was months and months and months ago, it was not a joyful place to be the way it once was. So it's very, very hard for me to picture the way forward. I want to paint you the most beautiful, optimistic picture of a rosy world ahead, but it's pretty hard for me to see it at the moment.
You said something earlier, Rachel, that really struck me, which was we're potentially losing a generation of artists
Mm-hmm.
right now. And I'm curious, for emerging designers, for, as you said, students getting ready to come out of design school or art school soon, whether it's this year or in the next 2 to 3 years. It's hard to even know, but what advice might you give those folks right now?
Oh boy. um, this is always true in this field. I think the people you see as you move through, I saw as I moved through the years doing this, that there were sort of people would sort of fall away from this work in waves, because it's very hard. You have to really, it has to be your deepest passion, or it's just too hard financially, but also the lifestyle. You have to be suited to so many things, and I watched people sort of fall off senior year in college. And then when I was 25, a whole wave of people were like, you know what, this isn't for me. And then again at 30, it was almost on the fives, and 35. And then past 35, it started to be when people wanted to have families and they were just like, I can't do this work. And when we have families, and I think my worry for the next generation of people is that they don't have the opportunity to really lean in and see if they love it and if they want to do it and if they can make a way of it, or if that opportunity is going to not come their way for a little while. My advice to young people in the normal time of life is always to see as much theater as you can and be around as much theater as you can and find your passion and find the group of people with whom you most truly speak as an artist. Find your voice, and that's just hard to do right now. So my hope is that people will still. My belief, my deepest belief, is that theater will come back. It is fundamental to who we are to gather and to hear stories. That thing that happens in a theater when an entire room full of people starts to have their heartbeat synchronized and they start to respond to a play together as a room. There's nothing else like it. There's I've never believed theater will disappear, and I don't believe it now. So I'm just hopeful that the people for whom this is their most true voice, they will find a way to stay with it until we can get back up on our feet. And we just don't know when that's going to be.
So it was great to hear her, end with a positive, optimistic note about that future of theater. It will survive. It will come back. And yet it was also hard to ignore her concerns, about what's it going to look like and what will it take and who will survive. And behind that, sort of the culture of the theater, I thought we heard so clearly her concerns of things that need to change as theaters come back.
Right. And she's certainly been in the vanguard of helping create that change. I love what she said about re-examining these practices, these labor practices in the theater that are only there because of tradition,
Right.
like the 10 out of 12 work days in the theater where, it's 10 out of 12 for actors, but designers have to be there for notes long after and early in the morning to make the changes before the run through. So, it's impossible for a designer to have a family with that kind of workday,
Right.
and especially to keep a roof over her head if she's working these 15-hour days and barely scraping by.
The culture is clearly a concern for her and something she pointed out, whether it was the long hours or the equity issues, diversity issues, women of color. The way I would see it, Pier Carlo, is it seems to me that these theaters, as they come back, that the mission and the culture and their vision needs to re-examine how those are drafted and what it means culturally to have equity baked into themselves, to treat people differently, she talked about having space to think and do the work differently, so really cultural transformation is at the forefront of an opportunity as these theaters recover.
Yeah, and it makes me think of the future theater makers who will create their own companies. It'll be easier
Right.
for them to bake that equity into their mission statements from the start. I think it's going to be harder for the older theaters to really erase practices they've pursued for decades and
Right.
start from scratch. But, if it weren't for people like Rachel finally kind of getting the brass ring in terms of her career, and people of color finally having access to some prestige in the field. If it weren't for them, the largely white institution leaders would have no idea that there were any problems with the way they were running things. So
Right.
I'm so grateful
Yeah.
to her and to
Totally
her
agree.
colleagues.
I think it sets a precedent of how these systems could think about creating support systems for future artists. In the
Right.
business world, they call it building bench strength, or you might have heard this phrase succession planning. But it's that idea of what are we doing to more proactively groom the next generation?
Right. And part of that succession planning is it takes a visionary leader to realize that, oh, my successor shouldn't be exactly like me.
Right. Right. Or look like me, or sound like me, or have ideas
Or
like
look like
me.
me or sound like me or have
Yeah.
the same ideas as I. Yeah. Let's hope more of those leaders come into positions of
Yes.
power.
Yes.
Well, it was sobering to speak with her, but also encouraging
Yeah.
because she is really stepping into her full position of power and leadership and authority and bringing wonderful people with her.
Agreed.
If you'd like to take a peek at one of Rachel's designs and also enjoy a wonderful play in the process, What the Constitution Means to Me is currently streamable on Amazon Prime. And no, we're not getting any money from Amazon Prime. We just
No,
want you to
but you should check it out.
Yeah.
If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by leaving us a rating wherever you get your podcasts so that more listeners can find us.
If you admire an artist in your community who's changing the status quo in their field and in your community, let us know. We'd love to hear any more ideas for guests. You can find me on Twitter at PCTalenti, or you can leave us a message on Facebook at Creative Catalyst. If you'd like to read a longer version of our interview with Rachel, please head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. One word.
Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Rob Kramer.
And I'm Pier Carlo Talenti. Thank you so much for listening.